Hello everyone, this is the third video in the series for Middle-earth collectible card game strategy and deck building. This video I'm going to go into building and designing the hazard side of your deck. Hazard construction is a bit more complicated than resource construction. When you're calculating out your resources, you can very easily set a plan. You know, we have the geography, we have the resources that we're playing in it, we have a protection strategy for what we think will get our characters to those resources untapped and able to play them. When you're making your hazards, on the other hand, you have to guard against every possible resource deck you might run up against in some way. So you can't focus on a single plan the way you can on your resources. You have to be much more reactive. That being said, a lot of the same general principles apply. The ideal hazard deck is fast to play, brutally effective, playable in a wide variety of circumstances, and it's an annoying design brilliance of the game that cards generally only do one of those things well at a time. So, like, if you're going creature heavy, yeah, I'd love to hit my opponent with a bunch of Nazgul and dragons, but chances are they're going to be clogging my hand because most people don't go to places where Nazgul and dragons hang out. If I go for something more playable, say orcs, then or animals, I'm going to have a lot of easily playable hazards that, unless I come up with some sort of support for them, are probably too weak to menace my opponents very much. You also want to make sure that your individual hazard deck works well with the resource side of things. So, for instance, with the deck we have here, yes, I've got 4 major items and I plan on hanging around with all of them. I do not want to field Scorba at home, who gives all major items an extra corruption point because it's going to hurt me as bad, if not worse, as it's going to hurt my opponent. I'd only really consider that if I had a deck where I was not playing any major items. You don't want to build a resource setup, say you're doing Radagast, you have lots of, you want to run through lots of wilderness so you can draw a lot of cards. So you think, okay, I'll play Gates of Morning and Fog and Echo of All Joy to keep everything in a wilderness. A good synergizing with that sort of resource setup would be a lot of deep wilderness creatures that can operate in the environment you've created with your resource deck. A very bad hazard strategy would be something that involves Doors of Night that knocks out all of your cards that you set up for the resource side. The other thing you should keep in mind is that I've talked a little bit about flexibility. You always want more flexible is better than less flexible, but oftentimes powerful combinations are at the cost of flexibility. If I'm playing a deck, say, that's based around Aragorn's thematic stuff, I want to play the Army of the Dead, so I'm going to need both Path of the Dead and Army of the Dead in my hand at the same time. If I draw one sooner, I have to hold it in my hand until I draw the second one. Similar thing with, say, the Narsalandoral Reforging. None of those cards are very powerful without all 3, so you might be having stuff in your hand for multiple turns. That sort of deck needs a very fast and free-flowing hazard deck because you only have so many card spaces you want to be hanging on to things for a while. This deck, on the other hand, has a very flexible resource side. There are no resources that are dependent on other resources. I don't have anything that's going to create extra direct influence, so I can play my fellowships very quickly, confident that I'm not going to get more direct influence and want to play more characters and disrupt the thing. Even the allies are kind of secondary. So with that in mind, I can afford with this deck to be a bit more combinatoric on my hazard side. Obviously, if I'm playing a different sort of resource deck and I don't have that kind of flexibility, then I'm probably looking to find the flexibility in my hazard side of things. And you should generally, if you want super, super fast, you can go flexible on both ends. But in generally, I try to do something flexible on one end and something combinatoric on the other. In our case, we went flexible resource, so we're going to go. I think we should really try to set up something nasty and death trappy on the hazard side. Now, when you're starting your hazard deck, again, standard is 30 card deck. With hazards, you write in Mouth of Sauron, and then you figure out the other 29 cards. Loudmouth over here is a decent Dark Domain, Darkhold creature, but his real power is that you can recycle any hazard from your discard pile back to your hand. You can get anything you need when you need it. I also almost always include 3 rivers. River is the most basic. Oh, this is just my particular insanity, but I like the Wizards versions. I don't use Lidless Eye versions in a hero deck. River is a no-risk, easy-to-play card. You force them to tap a ranger, and if they don't, they can't do anything at the site. Ideally, you want to force the ranger to tap first and then throw the river at them, but it's just there's no way it can go wrong. It's a cheap, effective card. Now that we have those 4 in place, we should think about the strategy behind the rest of the 26 cards. Now, you always need to have at least 12 creatures. Characters like Loudmouth, which are creature or an event, are count as half. So you can never do like a pure corruption or pure roadblock strategy. I do actually like creatures, though, at least personally. Creatures can prevent your opponent from playing resources in a way that I find a bit more reliable than the roadblock, where stuff like hazards and GI-based, stuff like corruption and GI-based hazards tend to punish your opponent after they play the resources, and that is a little too uncertain for my personal tastes. So given what we've got here, short moving, strong against orcs especially, I think I'm going to go for an orc-based strategy, because a lot of orcs have as their great advantage that they're very, very easy to play. They're throwable pretty much everywhere except for free domains and freeholds, and your opponent can't stick in those sorts of areas forever. However, orcs are weak. Orcs hazards tend to have a lot of strikes, but Orc Warband is a puny 4 prowess. Orc Patrol, I think it's called, is a 6. Orc Warriors are 7. A lot of characters can face the strikes untapped without any particular fear. So if you're going to do orcs, we need to strengthen them up. And the main combination for strengthening orcs up is Doors of Night. We want 3 of those. And Minion Stir. With Minion Stir and Doors of Night is in play, all of our orcs are +2 strikes, +2 prowess. There honestly is a very, very big difference between the relatively puny 3 strikes at 7 orc warriors without it, and 5 strikes at 9 with it. Some other support hazards that I like, I'm not sure I'm going to include them in the final version of this draft, but I want to show them off for orcs. Are Host of Bats, in one sense, is a free hazard because you can play one of your orcs for free after this, so it won't really count against the hazard limit if you've got a big pile to throw. It also makes your orcs deadlier because anyone who gets hit by an orc has to make double body checks. 2 or 3 tribes present lets me throw a whole hand of orcs down. I go back to this because, again, I'm not confident of one wave of orc to wear down my opponents. The other thing is that a lot of or actually I think it's only 3, but I'm going to include all 3 of them. And these guys probably will be making it into the final version of the deck. We have 3 orc types. They're all relatively easy to play, and they all get bonuses if they've been played after another orc attack. So you don't want to play these guys first. You want to play them set, but that means you have to have a lot of hazards in your hand and a lot of hazard limit to throw them, and 2 or 3 tribes present helps with that. So let's see. I think I want 3 Orc lieutenants, 2 Orc lieutenants, 2 Orc warbands. Let's go with 3 Orc warriors. And some hobgoblins. I want the dragons version again because I am funny that way. This gives us a reasonably good spread for anything short of free domains. We can bring one back. We have some nice support cards for them. And with our remaining 5 hazards, I do want to have at least a few corruption cards to keep my opponent honest. I'm probably going to have some in the sideboard. And speaking of sideboard, I'm going, especially since I have Doors of Night in play, I'm going to take 3 unexpected outposts. This will let me bring more hazards from my sideboard to my deck. And especially since I'm, I can be a bit flexible with whatever my opponent happens to have in place. I think I'm going to get rid of this host of bats. And, I'm actually going to get rid of this too. I'm going to use instead 2 versions of power built by waiting. This is a little more flexible. I don't think it's quite as powerful, but the idea is you play power built by waiting first. You increase the hazard limit when needed instead of just one big dump on your opponent. And you can recharge it later. So I think it's a little bit more flexible. It doesn't need to hang around in the hand the way 2 or 3 tribes present does. And with my final 2 hazards, I'm going to create a Lure of the Senses. Actually, I'm going to do Lure of Expedience. And a Greed. I'll probably have a few more corruption cards in the sideboard to bring out later. But I always want to have at least a little bit of corruption to keep my opponents honest. With no corruption at all, you're very vulnerable to your opponent playing a bunch of items, getting, especially like the sorts of items I'm packing. If I get a bunch of these weapons out, I will be very, very hard to hurt by any sorts of creatures, and you kind of have to fall back on the corruption to have any sort of help, any sort of slowdown or stoppage. Now that we've got our 30 cards in place, let's think about the synergies. I don't have anything that would create any sort of movement issues for my parties. I've got stuff that will enhance orcs, but my planned party includes 3 guys who have bonuses against orcs. Some people can make some, they can. Now, I do have Doors of Night, and I don't have any easy way to get rid of Doors of Night, so somebody else can feed off of it with their own similar cards. Like if somebody's doing an animal-based hazard, they could play Wake of War or if they're using spiders, what's it called? Full of Froth and Rage doesn't need Doors of Night. If they're doing Undead or Nazgul, they could play Morgul Knight off of my Doors of Night. But chances are, if they're doing that, they've got 3 Doors of Night anyway, so it's not the end of the world. And we are, again, somewhat protected. The Starglass will help us against undead or animals. We are somewhat vulnerable to Nazgul, with the only main anti-Nazgul thing we've got being Votelli, and she's not even in the starting party. I'm actually having second thoughts about Elven Rope if we're making the hazard setup nastier, because Elven Rope is only really useful if we can reliably defeat monsters and you want to use it as a kind of hedge against them playing stuff at you. So I think I'm going to get rid of Elven Rope in light of our hazard setup and go with Cram. Cram's a bit more flexible. We can just discard it to untap someone whenever we need it. And that, I think, is the main setup of our hazard deck. The next video, we'll go into the sideboard and kind of some basic thoughts about how the sideboard interacts with the main deck. Hope you enjoyed and hope you found this informative.